Chris from Revenge Performance. Today we're going to have a lot of fun. We are going to install a set of Fuel Injector Clinic 1650cc high impedance fuel injectors in our E85 powered twin turbo 1995 Dodge Stealth. For those of you that don't know, the Dodge Stealth has identical mechanicals to the Mitsubishi 3000 GT, so this guide will apply to both vehicle models. If you haven't seen our unboxing video for these FIC 1650cc injectors, please check out our YouTube channel and you can find out more about what these injectors are all about. These are a very high quality injector and they are needed for high power E85 setups, or if you're pushing a really high power gasoline setup, you may need these also. Currently this car has a 3.5 liter engine, VC 266/272 camshafts, DR750 turbochargers, which are about a 47mm inducer turbocharger, and it currently has 1000 cc injectors. We are just about out of fuel. At 24 to 25 psi of boost, we are hitting 100% injector duty cycle at about 12.4 to 1 AFR, so it's time for some bigger injectors. 25 psi is not enough, and we want to bring this setup out to its maximum. So stick along. We are going to zoom in on the exact engine work required to remove the plenum and the intake piping and get these fuel injectors installed. We may skip through a few of the really boring parts as we go along, but this will be almost a step-by-step guide on how to change fuel injectors on one of these cars. One thing we will note is if you are going to run high impedance fuel injectors on your Dodge Stealth or Mitsubishi 3000 GT, you need to bypass your fuel injector resistor pack because the stock ECU and stock injectors are wired for low impedance, and without bypassing the resistor pack, your injectors are not going to operate under the correct voltage or the correct resistance, and you may have problems. It's a very simple operation to do. We may make a blog post about it in the future, but essentially you cut off the stock wiring plug from the stock resistor box and you solder all 7 wires together, all 6 injector signal wires and the main power wire for that harness. So that is actually very easy to do. Don't let that intimidate you. These 1650cc injectors actually have a stock type injector electrical connector, which I refer to as an EV1 type of injector connector. It's kind of what the traditional fat body injectors were from that time period when these cars were manufactured, and so you won't have any other electrical changes to make to the car. This particular car, since it already had high impedance injectors, actually has the newer EV6 type of connector, and we are going to use a set of plug-and-play adapters to adapt the EV6 wiring harness this car has back to the EV1 plug that these injectors have. If you have any questions or comments, please add them to the video. Once you've watched it all the way through, we'd be glad to answer any questions you have about these fuel injectors. These are not only offered in 1650cc configurations, but they go smaller and larger as well. There's a 1200cc fuel injector that would probably actually be perfect for this car, but we stepped up to this 1650cc just to really be sort of the last injector that this car is going to need. Very unlikely we'll outgrow this injector. These 1650cc Fuel Injector Clinic Bosch-based injectors also have stainless steel internals, and so they're going to be great for this car. This car sits with the 85 in the tank for a few weeks at a time in between excursions, and so it's great to know that we're not going to have to worry about much corrosion or water getting into the injectors and causing them to lock up. These are motorsports-based injectors. These are built by Bosch originally, and FIC matches them and modifies them to their standards. These are dynamically matched. What that means is not only does FIC match these by their flow rating, they match them by their injector latencies and offsets. And so every injector set comes with its own unique set of latency and offsets that you can plug into your ECU. This ensures that you're going to have very good idle and cruise quality, and your injectors are going to behave in a consistent manner. Each one of your cylinders is going to have the same latencies, which just means how long it takes basically for the injector internals to come off their seat and go back. And so you don't have to worry about a very low pulse width, one cylinder having a lot different AFR than the others. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you're not familiar with the 3000 GT or Dodge Stealth platforms, to do a lot of work you have to take the plenum off, and including doing the spark plugs. And so that's going to be our first step. We are going to remove the intake piping involved, and we are going to take the plenum off. And once we're there, it's really no more difficult than replacing spark plugs. It's just a few more bolts that will allow us to remove the fuel rails and remove the injectors. So this car has a set of aftermarket pipes here. You can see here that this Y pipe is stainless steel, and these other pipes are also stainless steel. Your stock type car may have a rubber configuration here or a plastic Y pipe. Really doesn't make a lot of difference to the steps we're going to take here today. We're basically going to take this Y pipe out of the way and these other pipes as necessary, and we'll also loosen the throttle body because that'll make it a little bit easier to not take this plenum off. This rear pipe will have to come out of the way and loosen the rear turbocharger. Once that's done, there's just a few more bolts and this plenum will actually pull right off. So there's really not a lot of tools you're going to need to do this. Basically a 10 millimeter, an 11 possibly, depending on your T-bolt configuration, 12 and a 13. And in the case of this car, this actually has a lot of these Allen screw heads here, and so we're going to need some Allen sockets to do that. So I'm not going to be able to call out every single fastener tool you're going to need to remove these. Just kind of use some common sense to get your intake piping and things out of the way. We'll go ahead and start with this Y pipe because that's going to be pretty easy to do. And my T-bolts are an 11 millimeter nut, and so we'll go ahead and take those loose. Now we are going to use a battery operated impact wrench. Obviously you can do this by hand if that's what you have to work with, but the battery powered tools or an air powered tool will make the job go by a lot quicker. Once again, be careful with what you're doing. Take advantage of any safety equipment you're going to have, eye protection, things like that, and just watch because these are a pretty cramped engine bay. There's a lot of places where you can catch your fingers on things or catch your elbow on a T-bolt thread, things like that that can make you bleed a surprising amount. And you want to avoid that, of course. If we can get to a job on a 3S with absolutely no blood, then that just adds to our success level. So we're going to go ahead and get started. It's really helpful to stay organized when you're working on a car, and so we keep tools directly in front of the cars we're working on, and it makes it extremely easy to get to them. Just be very careful with all the bolts and things like that you find. You really don't want to set a bolt down somewhere and not be able to find it later. I think when I was a kid, I found that I spent as much time looking for bolts and tools as I did actually working, and I've learned a lot of lessons since then. One of the big ones that you can do is if you can put a bolt back after you remove it, do so, because then there's no way you're going to lose it later. So we're going to go ahead and loosen these T-bolts. See here, that's pretty much loose there. I'm going to loosen the one on the throttle body. Come around the side here. Grip this one here. Okay, so that's got the bulk of that loose. You may find it's a little bit easier to remove if you have hard pipes. To go ahead and loosen up a few more of these bolts. This is a little tight here, so I'm going to switch to some hand tools so I don't scratch up my valve cover. This is just going to give us a little more room to work. You can see while I'm working on this, I'll talk about a few of the parts this car has. Beyond the major items, we have always kind of believed in high quality couplers. And so we are running Samco couplers on here, some of the best you can get. Vibrant also makes a high quality coupler. We are also running Samco silicone radiator hoses here, which just hold up a little bit better than rubber, and they give us a really good lifespan, and they also look really nice. So that is also an option. I'm going to come around the side here and start loosening these. It's kind of best due to you're going to have a little lip in here, and so it's kind of best just to slide these off. These Samco couplers, these are 2-inch couplers for this piping. These are really tight, and so if they've even been on for a while, you may have to twist them kind of get a twisting motion here to get these off, which is working just fine. I don't recommend lubricating these to get them off. You're going to find that later on it's hard to get rid of all that lubricant, and you're going to have them slipping off under high boost, and you don't want that. So it is a little bit hard to work on when they're that tight, but it is good for keeping your couplers on under heavy boost. I want to remind everyone, anytime they take any of their intake piping apart, it's a great idea to do a pressure test later, which simply means putting boost into the system and checking for any leaks anywhere, because anytime you disturb any of this piping, there's a chance it's going to leak. And so you don't want to throw away your boost and have it just pressurizing the atmosphere. It's kind of hard on the turbos, reduces their efficiency, and also is going to add to your lag and may reduce some of your horsepower as well. So this one's tight as well. Go ahead and twist this. See that that's come loose. This has a hose here we need to remove on the back. If you ever find any of your piping or anything like that won't come off, don't really try to force it. Just look for what the problem is. There's quite a few vacuum hoses on these cars. Even in an aftermarket type of setup like this, you're still going to have things for your boost solenoid and your boost gauge or your map sensor, fuel pressure regulator. There's still quite a few of those to go. So we're just going to push that out of the way as well. And this should be getting pretty close. You can see here we have two more connectors. We have our air intake temperature sensor. This car runs a AEM Series 2 in speed density mode, which means there's no MAF sensor, but it does mean the ECU needs an air temperature sensor to work properly. And again, you want to twist these instead of just pulling on them if they're stuck. This is a Tile 50mm blow-off valve. It's another great product out there. One of the higher flowing valves out there. Just works really well too. Anytime you start exposing the system here to open air, you want to plug up any intercooler pipes you have. If you don't do that, you may drop a nut in there, or a tool, or just anything like that. And if that ends up in your engine, you're going to have some serious problems. You do need to remember that those are there though. We have heard stories of people not knowing they had rags in their intake system, and that causes problems too. So now we have a lot clearer shot at a lot of these items. The next step we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove this throttle body off to the side. You can lift this plenum up out of the way without removing the throttle body. We've done plenty of times to do a spark plug change. To really have enough room to work on fuel injectors, it's a good idea just to go ahead and take it out. And it will give a better shot for the audience here to be able to see what's going on if we can get this plenum completely out of here. The stock throttle body bolts are going to be a 12mm. I typically like to loosen all the bolts first, rather than starting to remove them completely. I want to give a shout out to April Best. She polished this plenum and throttle body, and that was a few years ago, so probably could use a little bit of polish again, but it's a very high quality service. I believe you can find her on Facebook. She also rebuilds these throttle bodies, which involves replacing the throttle shaft seals. Now that we have these four bolts out, we can kind of slide this throttle body out of the way. There's also a gasket. It's important to note that there's an orientation that's correct for this gasket. This little piece here faces the back and up. So save this gasket. It's not a bad idea to replace both the throttle body gasket and your plenum gasket when you do this. There's a couple more hoses we need to remove from the plenum. This one here, and your configuration may be slightly different. I'm going to go ahead and pull this off as well. And you can see here, we'll push this out of the way. There's a couple of screws here, which holds the knock sensor and the oil pressure connector. we'll just slide this out of the way. So when we pull the plenum off, it's very easy. There's also the 2 bolts for the throttle cable. It's not a bad idea to mark this so that you can put these back in the exact same spot. But we also like to kind of check the tension before we start on this throttle cable and set it the same way when we're done. You don't want a lot of slack in that throttle cable, but you don't want it so tight that it's actually holding the throttle open and the car won't idle correctly. Now you'll want to just slide this out of the way. There's one more hose over here for your brake booster that we're going to want to take loose with a screwdriver. On a stock car, there may also be another hose in the back here for your clutch booster, but this car is set up a little bit differently. These little hoses are a very common wear item. They're a great thing to replace if they're dry or cracked. It's also important to note these hoses are not just a hose. There's actually a one-way check valve in them, and if you don't put a hose with a check valve in it back in, you're going to have issues with boost actually getting into your boosters instead of just vacuum like it's supposed to be. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove the bolt that holds the rear intercooler pipe to the turbocharger. Now we'll want to loosen this T-bolt clamp. At this point, we should be able to work this back pipe out. Once again, we're going to want to plug up this intercooler pipe with a rag. That way we don't drop anything down here. This one is especially prone to that due to its angle. So at this point, it's extremely straightforward. Basically, we need to remove any of the bolts that hold this together. On a stock configuration, these are actually studs on each end. You'll find nuts here instead of bolts. This car has a coil-on plug system, and so we are actually running a Plenum spacer here to give us enough clearance on the rear, and so this one is all bolts. One thing to be extremely careful is on a stock configuration, there's actually lock washers underneath these 2 nuts. Keep track of these. There are a lot of stories of people actually dropping these lock washers into the engine, and it will damage a piston and a valve in no time. So make sure that if you have 2 lock washers, you have 2 when you're done. We generally will switch these to a serrated nut instead of a lock washer arrangement, and then there's just no lock washer to lose. It's a good idea to work from your outside in, similar to an intake manifold, as you're loosening. Just going to remove all these bolts carefully and hold on to the washer on the bottom of these. Don't want to drop that in my engine. We like to use anti-seize on any of these bolt threads. It's a great idea because you have steel threading into aluminum, and at any time that happens, corrosion can occur and this can strip your threads out. By the way, these bolts only get torqued to 13 foot-pounds. A lot of people just make these way too tight, and all that can do is warp the plenum, and then it may also strip your bowl holes out and you'll have problems. Okay, now that we have all the hoses off and all the bolts, we want to very carefully start to lift this plenum out. If it catches hard on anything, we should find out what's wrong and not just yank it out. You can see here this actually came out very easily. Set your plenum somewhere safe. You don't want anything falling into its ports either. Here we will see the lower intake manifold on these cars here. You're going to see that there are 6 gaping holes here right now. This is another great opportunity for parts to fall into the engine, and so we recommend plugging these holes as well. There are some tools out there for doing this, little plates you can put on here, and those are nice, but we find that it works just as well. Just use it as shop rags. It doesn't hurt to take this crossover PCV hose off. This car has aftermarket fuel rails, but if you have a stock setup, it's going to be very similar. You're going to have a loop here on the end, as well as these fuel rail pieces here. You don't really need to disturb this loop generally. If you want to, you can take that off, but it should not be necessary. We do need to take these 4 bolts out to get to the fuel injectors. do want to note this fuel system could be under pressure. This car has sat for about a week, and so there's really no fuel pressure left in it. But if you have recently run your car, a good idea would be to pull the fuel pump fuse and then crank the engine over for a few seconds to relieve any pressure in it so you don't get a face full of fuel. You still may also get a little bit of fuel leakage, so have some rags handy. So we're going to go ahead and pull these four screws out. Once you've removed the 4 bolts holding the fuel rail assembly to the lower intake manifold, carefully grip these little plastic isolators here. These have a tendency to really fall into the engine, and they're extremely hard to retrieve at that point, and you don't want to lose them. You may have to pull up just a little bit to get enough clearance here. There's one. There's 2. There's 3. And 4. We haven't lost any of those. At this point, we're very close to the end of this job as far as the disassembly goes. We can pull this up. And some of your fuel injectors may stay in the lower plenum, and that's okay. On a stock configuration, there's actually a metal clip that holds them in place. On these fuel injectors, this does not have that. So I'm just going to grab these one at a time, wiggle them out of the lower manifold. You really don't want to get fuel everywhere, and you also don't want to lose these lower isolators and O-ring up top. This has an EV6 style connector here, which is just push to release. On your stock configuration, there'll be a metal band in here, and you just need to gently take a pick and pry that metal band out of the way, pull that off, and then the connector will come right off. I'm going to put these somewhere safe, and I'm just going to move on to the next one. It's not a bad idea to wear some neoprene gloves. This car has been running E85, so if you're going to store your injectors for any amount of time, there's a recommended procedure. You should basically apply a 9-volt battery voltage to them intermittently and spray some WD-40 into their inlet. This is going to flush out any of the E85 that may cause some long-term corrosion issues. After that, it's a good idea to put your injectors in a plastic baggie just to keep them safe and free from dirt. These are very good 1000cc injectors, and we're going to adopt a similar process with them because we don't want them to go to waste. One other step you should take while you're working on this is each one of these injectors has an isolator on the bottom that keeps it from falling too far into the lower intake manifold. Just make sure as you're working that you didn't leave one of those in here from before. If you try to run 2 of those, you're going to have an air boost leak or a vacuum leak depending on your throttle position. So the next stage is to just reinstall the newer injectors, and one thing that's a great idea is to lubricate the upper O-ring with a little bit of motor oil. You just want enough oil on there that slides in easily. We're also going to want to start with the ones on the passenger side to make installation a little bit easier. Gently twist until that snaps in, just like that. And we'll repeat the process for the remaining 5 injectors. Alright, now that we have all 6 injectors placed into the fuel rails, we really need to get these isolators in place while simultaneously lowering the fuel rails and the 6 injectors into their proper spot on the lower intake manifold. It's a really good idea to go through each of the 6 lower isolator holes and clean them of any dirt. Any leak at these lower isolators can actually cause a boost leak. Okay, now that we have that clean, I'm going to go ahead and mount these isolators in the lower intake. If you don't have a lot of experience with this, you might want to actually super glue these to the lower intake. It won't last, but it'll be good enough to complete the job and it won't fall out. Now we have to gently lower the fuel rails, trying to line up the 6 fuel injectors and their isolators with the lower holes. With a little bit of patience, they'll go right in. You have to make sure all 6 fit directly in their holes properly. I like to give them a wiggle just to make sure they're sitting in there right. Now we have all 6 fuel injectors installed. We'll put the bolts back in the lower fuel rail, attach the electrical connectors, and just reverse the procedure. The good thing about the FIC fuel injectors is they are a bolt-in, drop-in injector. They have hats and lower insulators that are machined to fit perfectly in your application. These bolts don't have to be tremendously tight. I believe the torque specification is 13 foot-pounds. We're going to snug them up and just do them by hand. These are plastic isolators and aluminum threads. Just don't force them too hard. Once we have those bolts in, it's a great idea to double check one last time, get a light in there and make sure that all your insulators are lined up, all your fuel injectors are in a happy spot. They should rotate with some force. They should not flop around with no force at all, but you should be able to grip them and wiggle them a little bit back and forth. And it looks like these are good. The next video we'll actually show the first startup on these injectors on our AM Series 2 once we've reconfigured the base map to not use a 1000cc injector but to use these 1650s.